Emma had always lived in her shell, as if surrounded by glass through which she could see the world but never touch it. Her days were gray, like the faded pages of an old diary. Work, home, the rare calls from her mother she always tried to end as quickly as possible. And the nights. The nights brought images she could never forget, dark hallways, laughing shadows, and a little girl trapped in a room. One evening, when the rain pounded against the windows so hard it seemed like it wanted to break in, the phone rang. At first, she didn't want to answer. But something, a strange, uncomfortable feeling, made her pick it up. The voice on the other end was quiet, barely audible, like the hissing of a snake. "The house has been waiting for you. It's time to come back." Her palms became clammy, her breath hitched. Her heart tightened as though icy fingers were squeezing it. "Who is this?" she whispered, but all she got in response was a dial tone. The receiver slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. She knew this wasn't an ordinary call. And she knew nothing would ever be the same again. The house stood atop the hill, dark and forbidding, like an old castle from a Gothic novel. Mist clung to the ground, wrapping around her legs. Emma froze at the gates, which seemed larger than she remembered. They creaked open on their own, as if inviting her in. She swallowed hard, trying to steady the trembling in her hands. "It's just a house," she muttered. "Stones, wood, nothing more." But deep down, she knew it was a lie. This house was alive. And it knew she had come. When she stepped inside, the air seemed to still. The walls, cracked and covered in mold, seemed to whisper. "You've come." At last, Emma flinched, looking around, but no one was there. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound stuck in her throat. The door slammed shut behind her with a heavy thud. There was no turning back now. The house was a labyrinth. Every step echoed loudly, as if the floor itself wanted to tell her something. The walls were stained with marks that looked like faces, or was it just a trick of the light? Emma tried not to look, but her eyes couldn't help tracing the cracks that seemed to form eyes staring back at her. "Do you hear us?" a voice whispered, low and hollow, like wind through a pipe. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling but edged with anger. She didn't want to show her fear, but her heart was pounding so loudly it felt like the house could hear it. In response, the walls seemed to shift. Or was it her imagination? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to focus on her breathing. But images flooded her mind, a little girl running through these halls, something chasing her. She stopped. What was she doing? Why was she here? Emma pressed herself against the wall, feeling its cold, damp surface. "This is a mistake. I shouldn't have come," she whispered, her words spilling out like a prayer to herself. The house seemed to hear her. The creaking of wood and faint whispers filled the space around her. The whispers grew louder until they turned into laughter. "You've always been weak," a voice said from somewhere far away, yet so clear it felt like it was inside her head. "You've always run away." Emma clenched her fists, but fear held her in place. Her legs refused to move forward. A single thought pulsed in her mind: go back. But the way back was already sealed. She didn't know how long she sat there, pressed against the wall, when she heard footsteps. A man, tall with long gray hair, emerged from the shadows. His eyes glowed amber, as if they held their own light in the dimness. "You're stuck," he said with a smirk. His voice was soft, yet it sent a chill through her. That's how it always starts. Do you want me to help? Who are you? Why are you here? Emma managed to ask, though her voice was barely audible. Me? Just someone who came here before you. Do you think you're the first? He leaned closer, his gaze piercing through her. No. But maybe you're the first who can make it out. They reached a door that looked older than the house itself. Its surface was covered in symbols Emma couldn't understand, yet they stirred something deep within her. The man pointed to it. This place is the key. But not a physical one. It asks, who are you? Do you know yourself? I'm not sure, she admitted, her voice trembling. How do I find out? Figure it out. Or stay here forever, he said, fading into the shadows. Emma touched the door, and the world around her vanished. Images flashed before her eyes, her childhood, her fears, her mistakes. Every step forward felt like a battle with herself. When she crossed the threshold, darkness enveloped her, filled with faces, familiar and unfamiliar, accusatory and forgiving. They screamed, laughed, called her name. Emma felt herself unraveling. Do you think you can win? A voice said from the darkness. It was her own voice, distorted. You've always been weak. You'll never change. Shut up. Emma shouted, clenching her fists. Her voice was steadier than she expected. You're not me. The darkness wavered, and a light appeared before her. In her hand, a key glowed. The house began to crumble. At dawn, she stood on the hill, watching the house disappear. In its place was an overgrown field. She breathed heavily, clutching the key in her hand. Its glow was fading. Freedom, she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried a quiet determination. But in her shadow, something flickered. For a moment, she turned, but saw nothing. Only the wind rustled the grass, as if whispering, "This isn't over."